Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 417th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Did you know the best seeds for your garden don't come from the nursery? In fact, the seeds that will create the most robust and delicious fruits and vegetables come directly from your garden. This is because they are uniquely adapted to your growing conditions, better than anything you can buy from a fancy catalog or website. Through the magic of seed saving, it is quite possible to have the garden of your dreams. The best part is, saving your own seeds is surprisingly easy and fun. With a bit of instruction, anyone can become a seed-saving superstar. Let us teach you how in our free seed-saving webinar. Just text SEEDS to 33444 to sign up, or visit seedsavinghacked.org for more information. That's SEEDS to 33444, or visit seedsavinghacked.org. Today on our podcast, we have someone who is farming with an eye on the future. We're talking with Michael Foley about building a viable small farm economy. After 20 years in academia, Michael became a farmer. He started in southern Maryland, then moved to Willits, California, where he, his wife, and oldest daughter operate Green Uprising Farm. He is the co-founder, board member, and teacher of the School of Adaptive Agriculture, formerly known as Grange Farm School, a farmer training and education program. Michael has helped create and manage a community kitchen and small farmers group, managed the local farmers market, and has served as both vice president of Mendocino County Farmers Market Association and president of Little Lake Grange. And with all that, he found time to write Farming for the Long Haul, published by our friends at Chelsea Green. Welcome to the show today, Michael. Are you ready to rock?
I am.
Excellent. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Well, there are a lot of blanks because I'm an old guy, and the story really goes back to childhood, growing up on the outskirts of St. Louis in the 50s. I was always fascinated with farms and farmland, but already it was apparent that farms and farmland around me were decaying, going unused. Something was going on. A big moment was visiting a ranch outside of Roundup, Montana, where my father had spent many memorable summers with my great aunt and uncle, and telling myself, I was 12, I think, that I wanted to grow up and be a gentleman farmer.
Nice.
I didn't know what that meant. I had something in mind like Marx did when he said, you know, the real life would be getting up in the morning, fishing, followed by reading, followed by farming, followed by writing, something like that. No idea all the work entailed in a real farming life. But I'm sort of living that kind of life right now. But instead of going into farming, I was a bookworm and went into academia, where eventually I got a degree in political science when my first adventure in living in the country fell apart. I went back to grad school, got a degree in political science, which I started out thinking I was going to study peasant revolution and peasant agriculture.
Oh, wow.
And did spend a lot of time doing that. I did research in Mexico and in El Salvador in the 80s and the 90s. Did various other things as a political scientist, and then finally came around to thinking, I want out of academia. I want to farm. And coincidentally, a couple of my daughters were involved in one way or another with farming. My daughter Allegra had just spent 2 years in the horticulture program at Santa Cruz, the agroecology program.
Yep.
So I took a 6-month sabbatical. She came out to Maryland. I was teaching in D.C., and I had already started clearing a place and grown some crops on it. And then that next year, she and I did a 30-person CSA. I was a complete newbie. I was learning from her, and it went from there. A couple of years later, I retired, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
and came out to Willits, where another daughter was, on a piece of land we'd bought together, and that's Green Uprising Farm. We've been
Wow.
here since.
So interestingly, you and I have a bit of a shared path. When I was in the 7th grade, I wrote a paper on how we were overfishing the oceans, and that was 1974. Early in my life, I realized that there was something really wrong with the way we were living and eating on the planet.
Yeah.
I don't know where that
Certainly
came
is.
from. Yeah, exactly. There it is. And I have no idea where that came from. It's just, it was there for me.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly there for me, too. I don't know.
Well, yay. And the cool thing for me is that it is informed, since a very young age, it's informed many of the things that I've done, and it's driven my life passion. And it sounds to me like for you too.
Yeah, that's certainly true. It has, and yet, this is urban farm. I spent a lot of time living in urban areas and in suburban areas and walking around neighborhoods looking at the traces of nature
Mm-hmm.
and occasional urban gardens. And just, there was something that really resonated. But it wasn't until we moved out to the countryside, to Willits, that I realized how great a longing I had for being out in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I found that out with the first farming operation in southern Maryland, that I just loved being outdoors during the day when everybody else was cooped up in an office,
Yep.
including formerly myself.
Mm-hmm.
But that longing for being out there in touch with the land, just my hand in the dirt, seeing things grow, shaping an environment to the extent I could, that really came home when we moved here.
Yeah. Wow. So tell me just a little bit, because I want to get to your book, because this looks like an amazing book. But tell me a little bit about Green Uprising Farm. How big is it, and what do you do there?
We are what I've started calling, without embarrassment, a micro farm.
Nice.
We're just 5 acres. Almost 2.5 of it is a floodplain, and the only thing down there right now is a small 20 by 48 hoop house.
Mm-hmm.
The soil has been mostly wiped away by large storm events years ago, years and years and years ago, but still it's a threat because there's a creek down there.
Right.
And then the other 2.5 or 2 acres is up higher, silty sandy loam, former lake bed, on which we've got about 1/3 of an acre of gardens. And I am first and foremost a market gardener, and an old orchard. And then we're putting in new trees, and my wife's working on a food forest, putting in various things gradually in the 2 orchards we've got. She's also growing medicinal herbs. And then she has a very small herd of dairy goats.
Oh, nice.
So we do a lot of things. We do diversified market gardening, and we do backyard dairy.
Yeah. Wow. So Willits is that Northern California?
It's Northern California, about 2.5 hours north of the Bay Area, up Highway 101, on our way to the real deep woods, but already by the time you get to the Mendocino County line, you're in wooded hills, kind of rough country. Whole county, big county, has only 89,000 people in it. And we're scattered all over the place.
Wow.
In some small towns and even smaller local communities.
Yeah. Well, and, you mentioned this is the Urban Farm podcast, and I just want to address that. What I like to do is I like to find guests that are inspirational, that started out in doing something else like you and followed their dream and, started a farm like you.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
This is a great story. I had one thought. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you know it, but I run a large urban farm fruit tree program here in Phoenix, teaching people how to successfully grow fruit trees in the desert. And
I saw that on the website.
Yeah, and when you talked about your 2.5 acres that was a floodplain, my first thought was, oh my gosh, that would make a great orchard.
Yeah, the problem is that we recently tried to drill a well because we didn't want to depend on the creek. They got down 12 feet and hit blue clay, which went down another 200.
Oh, wow.
And they gave up.
Mm-hmm.
And the trees that were planted down there by the original homesteaders, they're all that's left are walnuts. They were originally English walnuts grafted onto black walnut stock.
Right.
In a lot of cases, the English walnut has died off because there's just not enough water down there, and the roots, couldn't really penetrate that clay.
Yeah.
And so we've got black walnuts sprouting up, and the English walnuts just don't produce much.
Yeah.
So we've got to do something else with it. We thought about olive trees. I don't know how they'd do.
Well, that'd be a good experiment to do.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your book, Farming for the Long Haul, Resilience and the Lost Art of Agricultural Inventiveness. How did you come about writing a book like this?
Part of it's a long story of my life, like being interested in agriculture and the anthropology of so-called primitive peoples for like 50 years. Doing the research I mentioned on peasant organizations and peasant agriculture in Mexico and El Salvador and around the world. All that was there, and I started teaching out of that store of stuff. But also I got frustrated working with a lot of young people who wanted to be farmers, and some of whom were getting started, and organizations that wanted to support them. I got frustrated with the kind of business advice they were being given, which presupposed that if you work hard enough and you're clever enough, you can make it in today's market. And yeah, that's true, but that presupposes that today's market is static and that we're not coming to the end of oil.
Right.
Petroleum's estimate is it'll all be over by 2050. Are we ready for that? Are we even thinking about that? It presupposes that the topsoil is going to last. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN says we have maybe 60 more harvests at this rate of soil erosion before it's all gone. That's 60 years.
Yeah.
And then there's climate change. So are we thinking about these things? Are we planning? So I put those two things together, and what the book is about is it's a plea, first of all, to think small. Secondly, to take the lessons of the agricultures of the past, which have often been very long-lived and sustainable. And when they made disasters, and they certainly did in some cases, they learned from them. They were resilient and adaptive and rebuilt agriculture. There's still wheat being exported from Syria, or there was before the Civil War. One of the ancient breadbaskets that was desertified partially and ruined by bad agricultural, but the Levant, that whole area, has recovered in certain ways. A more limited agriculture, but they've learned from their mistakes. We need to learn from their adaptations to be prepared for what we're facing.
Yeah. Well, and
the immediate and distant future.
Yeah, you sent me a copy of the PDF copy of the book, and I'm sitting here looking at the table of contents, and I had to laugh when I read the name of the first chapter, Farming in the Ruins of the 20th Century. Tell me about that.
Well, as I said, I was beginning to see it in the early 50s as a child. American farms were shutting down, and they continued to shut down. Millions of farmers went under in the last half of the 20th century. Soil erosion accelerated, slowed down briefly with some good government programs, and then accelerated again with some bad government programs. And most recently, we've gotten from the business press the news that the rate of bankruptcies in the big commodity farms of the upper Midwest has begun to skyrocket again. So farmers are going under. The soil's degraded. Our health is degraded because of our commodity farming system and subsidized food that goes into junk food and junk meat. And, there's just so many pieces to that story. Wendell Berry, of course, started the whole conversation with the unsettling of America in 1976.
Well, and I suspect that your book, and looking down the chapter names, is looking at thinking small but also stepping away from the commodity markets, because basically the commodity markets is corn, wheat, soy, that really don't feed us, right?
Yeah. So we're looking to revitalize grain production in Mendocino County, for example. Used to be a net exporter of grain, and now probably 100%, very close to 100% is grown here. A little project called the Mendocino Grain Project has begun to bring grain back, and there are some old farmers who still farm grain, but mostly for animal feed, for raising their animals. That's the scale. Selling it to local farmers, raising local animals, or selling it in local farmers' markets. That's the scale where commodities might make sense. And also might be profitable.
Yeah.
Because if you're selling direct to customers, you're much more likely to make a profit than you are trying to farm 10,000 acres and selling to the monopolies, to the Cargills, to the Archer Daniel Midlands.
One of the things that's happened here in the desert Southwest is there was a grain called Sonoran white wheat that was rediscovered. And, through a friend of mine, Bill McDormand, he and a group of people resurrected it. And that's one of the big grains that is now grown here.
Is it? Oh, good.
Yeah, and it's used in breads and, used in people food it's not being raised for animal food.
I use it in my own artisan bread that I make 4 loaves of a week.
Right.
I have a friend who does bread for Farmers Market who also does a loaf with Sonoran white wheat.
Oh,
yeah.
So you're actually using Sonoran white wheat.
We are. Yep.
Excellent. It's a nice grain and it grows well. And the cool thing that's happening here in the Phoenix market is that there are a few farmers that are actually raising it organically, which gives us bales of straw that's organic straw.
Yes. Isn't that an added benefit?
That is huge.
One of the things I spend a lot of time on in the book is the whole farm, the importance of thinking of the bottom line in terms of all the things the farm gives back to you, including the wild part of the farm. But, that straw from a wheat crop, organic straw no less, is valuable. It's part of the bottom line.
Yeah, well, and, about 10 years ago, maybe it was 15 years ago, I started thinking about all of the chemicals that were being used at on the straws and alfalfas that I was using for mulch on my farm here.
Yeah.
Now, when you say 5 acres as a micro farm, I have 1/3 of an acre. So, it's even smaller of a micro farm. And I had to pay attention to the products that I was bringing on site and how much chemicals was being used in them. So about 10, 12 years ago, I stopped using alfalfa and straw because of those chemicals. And Jana over at Pinnacle Farms here in town, I get organic straw from her, and that we use. And that's that way I'm not hauling in extra chemicals when I'm bringing that stuff in.
Yeah, it's a real concern.
It is. So chapter 3 is subsistence first. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, if we look back at agriculture through the centuries and across the world, it's rarely been dominated by markets. And generally where it's been dominated by markets, urban civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, eventually it's destroyed the soil and the basis for the soil.
Right.
And agriculturalists have been sometimes slaves, but, generally exploited. But most people, most of the time, through the centuries, through the millennia, have farmed for their own subsistence and that of their communities. If they had a market, the market was really secondary to that. It was for trading specialty items.
Right.
It wasn't what their livelihoods depended upon. And I was looking for lessons from that vast history of agricultural experience, and that struck me as a central one. If we don't pay attention to our own subsistence and to what the farm can contribute to that, then in the long haul, when the market fails us, or our little constellation of markets fail us, then we're just going to go out of business, like the millions of American farmers who have gone out of business over the last 100 years.
Right.
instead of continuing to do what we love and what's so important, producing food for ourselves and for other people. So subsistence first.
Let's talk about what that means, subsistence. Basically, it's providing for our own needs.
Yes. So one thing we're looking at here, and my wife Sarah is really pushing this forward, is looking at including high-calorie crops in our mix of crops.
Mm-hmm.
Not just salad mix, which we're really well known for and make good money on, but also corn and beans and potatoes and squash eventually. We have a neighbor who has developed a couple of kinds of quinoa, especially adapted to our area.
Wow.
And even though quinoa gives me a stomachache, it's a valuable supplement, a valuable calorie crop. So we're focusing on those sorts of things, but also on, a little bit of meat from our animals, but also part of subsistence first is being in a network, a community where we're trading things. Like we trade milk for meat with a couple of different farms.
Uh-huh.
We don't count the cost. We just say, how much milk do you want? And they say, well, how about this in trade? And they give us something
Right.
every week or two. So that kind of strategy, thinking about how neighbors can support neighbors and you can support yourself and your neighbors, I think is key to farming for the long haul.
One of the things that comes up for me when you say that is I have a vision of creating Phoenix. There's 4.4 million people in Phoenix. Creating Phoenix into a place that grows enough food for us here. And really, that's what we're talking about is subsistence farming in all of our yards, I think, yes?
Yeah, and in all those vacant lots where downtown Phoenix used to be. I was just there and noticed by the airport, a big old church surrounded by
dirt.
Empty lot.
Yeah.
And dirt. I'd seen that before on trips through Phoenix. And yeah, there's a lot of possibility there.
Yeah. So what do you want people to take away from your book?
Oh, I'd certainly like that lesson that when we think about the bottom line, we ought to be thinking about more than profitability in today's markets.
Mm-hmm.
We ought to be thinking about providing for ourselves and our neighbors and building networks among ourselves so that we can help one another. So that's a big takeaway. I guess the other big takeaway is, look, there are all kinds of techniques and inventions that farmers throughout the world, so-called primitive people doing non-modern agriculture, have come up with, some of which we still use, but a lot of which we don't pay attention to anymore. And delving back into those and pulling some of those back up and looking at them, the whole terrace cultivation that was part of Hohokam culture in your area, and Mountain Pima and, Apache and, all of that. There are lessons there, and there are things to bring back. Let's not just talk about swales like the permaculturists do. Let's look at all the terracing systems that are out there and see what's appropriate.
Thank you so much for diving in and putting this content out. It looks like a great book, and it's the place we need to keep our eye on. We need to put our eye on the future, looking at the past, pulling up what we can, and building a new farm system for our planet.
Yeah, exactly. That's the task, and that's probably the most important thing we could be doing, and it's great that you're doing it and doing the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I say that all the time. I think the most important thing that we can be doing right now is figuring out where our food comes from and how to grow our own.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that I noticed, I've been to Europe twice in the past decade. I was in Italy and Switzerland, and then I was in Croatia for 2 weeks about 4 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things I noticed is that everybody had food growing in their yards.
Yeah.
Everybody
And
had.
in Germany, they have pretty strict zoning laws. They have these Landkreise, I think they're called, circles around a town. But within that, there are urban gardens along the freeways or along the train tracks that are obviously really well used and kept up. Yeah.
So that's really my goal. My vision, I started about 10 years ago here in Phoenix, is what if we had 10,000 urban farms in Phoenix? That's where I'm heading with it.
The other thing that I make out of urban farming in the book, not so much the backyard farming, but the community farming on empty lots, as a refreshing break from this notion that you've got to own your own little homestead in order to farm.
Right.
People in urban areas have just had to get over it
right.
and work out ways to farm communally on the spaces that are available.
Yeah.
And that's really refreshing and important, I think.
Oh, big time. Well, interestingly, when I was in Croatia in 2014, I was there on a work trip. We were talking I was with a group of people that was helping this particular community of 100,000 people that we were visiting, helping them develop food infrastructure. The funny piece for me was they were asking us as experts to come and show them, but they were already doing it all. They already knew how to do it. So, that was the funny piece. But interestingly enough, I met several times with a group of people that had started a community garden. And they started it with 100 plots. And apparently those 100 plots went away in 24 hours. And they had a waiting list of 100 people. There's this culture there of, we really want to grow our own food. And I think that's a big piece of what we're missing here in the United States.
Yeah, I have noticed that the urban gardening project that one of our best local nonprofits runs in this area, some of the most successful urban gardens are mainly Mexican Americans. People who came out of a farming culture and, came here for farm work, but ended up in an urban setting in apartment buildings and so on. And just, they
want to grow their own food.
They want to grow their own food. They have the experience of it. They have the sense that it's an important thing to do, and they do it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I do, one of the podcasts, this is what the podcasts are all about. This is what all of the work that I do here with my fruit tree program, and we do a yearly seed event here, and we do classes, really is about putting infrastructure in place so that when stuff hits the fan, we've got the infrastructure here to back us up.
Yeah.
I can see your book being one of the guiding pieces in this conversation. So thank you for that.
Well, I hope it contributes.
Yeah. Well, from what I can see, it looks like it will. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Well, the one I've come up with, the one that strikes me is that first year in Maryland with a 30-person CSA. I was a newbie, and Allegra was not such a newbie. She'd also worked on a CSA farm before Santa Cruz. But what happened is we got hit by the beginning of a drought, a 7-year drought that struck the southeast at that time. It started in August, and from August through September, there was absolutely no rain. Now, for me, from California, that's no surprise, but I wasn't from California. I was in Maryland, and I had relied on a good rain once a week reliably. So we had no irrigation infrastructure, none whatsoever. Allegra knew something about drip tape from her experience at Santa Cruz, so we got a small amount of it, but it certainly wasn't enough. We had to, go to other farmers to fill those boxes for those 2 months. These were neighbors and families and friends who had sort of trusted us to provide food for their money. So we felt like we had to go and buy food from other farmers to get them their boxes. And that failure to anticipate, that's the biggest one that I can think of. And to some extent, I think maybe most of us still do that, including us here. We get into routines of production that suppose certain markets, suppose certain weather conditions, et cetera, and we're not adapting. We're not planning for the future. We're not thinking about it. And, a big drought like that may be a rare event, but it's not unthinkable by any means.
Especially if you're in California and Arizona.
Yeah, especially if you're in California and Arizona. Yeah. Any place in the arid West, yeah.
So what do you consider your biggest success?
I'm going to switch off of farming altogether, and even though it's struggling, I feel like helping to create this school, this farmer training program, and helping to bring together the young people that really have driven it forward and made it happen and that continue to be part of it, and that in increasing numbers as young people go through this program, populate the farm scene in this county. I feel really proud to be part of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important that young people are coming out of the woodwork and beginning to do this.
Yes. Oh, and it's wonderful. I do tours here at the Urban Farm 4 or 5 times a year, and there's a lot of boomers that show up on my tours. Like 80+% of the people are, older generations.
Yeah.
But there's this younger crew that's coming through that has me really excited. It gives me hope for our future.
Yeah. No, 11 years ago when we came here and got involved in community organizations and stuff, everybody was saying, where are the young people? Where are the young people? And now the young people are here.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in the leadership of the Grange. It's so exciting.
Yeah. So I would actually like to invite you to come back to the podcast and talk about your school, because that's another really important piece of, how do we get trained?
Yeah, I would love to do that. And maybe we could do it along with Ruthie King, who just stepped down as director, but came as a 25-year-old, became director very quickly, and really drove the thing forward. So
nice.
We can talk about that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So what drives you?
What drives me? I don't know. I mean, I was raised with a sense of community involvement by my father and community service by the Jesuits at my high school. But I also, just in talking about farming, I just love work. I love getting things done. And even if it's hard work and if it's tedious and sometimes discouraging, still getting through it and getting it done and shaping things, making things happen. And I guess that's true in the abstract level too, on, making a book happen or helping to make a community organization better. All those things.
Yeah.
Just give me satisfaction. That drives me.
Nice. So if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
That's really hard because I'm a reader and I read a lot of stuff. But since we're talking about farming, I want to recommend Elliot Coleman's The New Organic Grower, because Coleman, in contrast to my book, which speaks about a lot of other people's experience, he talks about his experience, but it's not just his experience, it's his experiments. It's his taking the knowledge of the past and the knowledge of the present and trying to figure things out, and he models it in the book. He walks you through the techniques and the tools and the infrastructure that he has experimented with and created over time, and gives you lots of options. And so I think it's a wonderful education in how to hack farming.
Yeah. So he was an extraordinary person to talk to. We actually interviewed him for episode 400 of the Urban Farm podcast.
Oh, so, really?
Yeah. If you want to hear from Elliot Coleman, I got chills having that interview with him. He was, and he's getting up there in age, but man, he is all there. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
If you get into gardening, if you get into farming, the central, most important thing that's easiest to neglect is observation.
Oh, yes.
Not just learning from other people's example, which is what I'm urging in the book, but observation on your own about what's going on with your plants, with your soil, with your climate. It's a hard one for somebody raised as an intellectual like me who's been estranged from the land for so long to learn, but it's so important, and I cultivate it every day when I can. So I think observation is the key, and the core that and the care that follows from that.
Yeah, well, and the first premise and basic premise of permaculture is to go out and observe.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what's so wonderful about permaculture. Also, holistic management. The first premise is monitor, monitor, monitor. Try something, monitor, and then adjust.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, and of course, that's the same thing in permaculture. The same sort of general advice.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
You bet. How can our listeners get a hold of you?
Well, I'm launching a website called anothermadfarmer.net, after a poem by Wendell Berry that I love,
Mm-hmm.
The Mad Farmer's Manifesto. So anothermadfarmer.net. And I can give an email address if
Perfect.
people want to write.
Perfect.
That's fine. Foley, Foley, dot M as in Michael, W as in William, @gmail.com.
Excellent. And I'm really excited for our listeners. We have a special bonus. Chelsea Green has offered us 5 copies of Farming for the Long Haul, and they need a new home. So if you email us at podcast@urbanfarm.org with the subject line, I am in it for the long haul, and provide us your name and mailing address, we're going to pick 5 random emails from the first 50 people that respond, and we'll send you that book. Thank you, Chelsea Green. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/long haul. We are your urban farming resource. You can find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and every place you find podcasts. Also visit urbanfarm.org to find articles, webinars, courses, and more. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Claiming your inner urban farmer is easy. Grow food, share it, and name your farm. Then let the world know you're an urban farmer while supporting our podcast. Pick up your Urban Farmer bling, hats, and t-shirts at I'mAnUrbanFarmer.com.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.